After the Revolution, the area around Jefferson County, it broke off from Berkeley County and became Jefferson County itself in 1801, but it was a period of great prosperity. The reason was that during the French Revolution and all the turmoil in Europe, they needed wheat. And the kind of wheat that our farmers grew here was somehow particularly well suited for the transoceanic transport. And people became very prosperous here all through that period. It's when you see the homes starting to get bigger. You see the two grand nephews of George Washington, Bushwick Corbin Washington and his brother John Augustine Washington move up here, and they each build a home facing one another, and one of them's 32 rooms. Very prosperous. Slavery is still depended upon. 96 enslaved persons, and I never use the word slave. Someone's doing some enslaving. 96 enslaved persons built this 32-room mansion. So it was very prosperous, but there was always that undercurrent. If you were an African American in Jefferson County in the 1820s and 30s, the general realization was that further south was worse because they did a lot more whipping, and I saw some personal accounts. But even though you had a lot of freedom and you could move about, and your ability to escape was very good because all you had to do was get to cross a river or two. The fear of being sold south at any moment for financial reasons was always there. And truly, there was some quiet and there were very brutal acts, like a man's hand being cut off for lying by his owner. But those were considered, abhorrent to the classes in general. So 1 in 4 were enslaved going up to the Civil War. It was really, one man wrote that whether you had 50 acres or 300 acres, you could live so well here, with corn and hogs, It was like a land where we were dreaming, even for those who were enslaved, because it just wasn't quite, everything just jumped out of the ground. Now, when things started heating up, as we all know, the differences of opinion between Western Virginia and Eastern Virginia were always simmering, starting in the 1830s, because of the way the taxes were manipulated, favoring, giving a discount to those who enslaved somebody in Eastern Virginia. So it got worse and worse and worse, and dramatic events. First, you need to have, remember I said that George Washington's life is always shaping our life. The establishment of the Harper's Ferry Armory in 1798 first brought the John Hall's revolution, industrial revolution here. Then it brought 2 railroads, the Winchester-Potomac, which kind of was a north-south route from Maryland into the valley, short little railroad. And then, of course, the masterful B&O Railroad. Anyone who wants to look closely at the Civil War will realize that the B&O was so central to Abe Lincoln's thinking. That's what people don't understand. When Lincoln says, I'm fighting for union, he's practically saying I'm fighting for the union of the railroad, because about 50 miles of it, like loose string, as the B&O went from Baltimore to Ohio, this little bit of loose string dribbles into Virginia at Harper's Ferry and goes through Martinsburg and back out at Cherry Run. So if they secede, a chunk of his wonderful railroad, which he'll need for military transport, is in an alien country. Harper's Ferry obviously becomes enormously strategic, again, because of all of these decisions through time. And John Brown decides he's going to have a raid there. We can debate many things, but I think Dennis Fry and other really good historians would say, put it this way, that the strategy of holding hostages or holding the arsenal at Harper's Ferry was flawed because of it's so easy to capture, because it's not easy to defend. But there's no question that he succeeded in his sort of philosophical war. When John Brown came here, this county went completely bananas. The white culture went crazy. They just went savagely crazy. I mean, my point is, Jefferson County alone was convinced that this was the beginning of the war against slavery, and that it was going to land in its heaviest foot in Jefferson County. There's a myth that African Americans here did not help. What they did is they saw rather quickly that John Brown did not plan it well. And by the way, if you're an African American and you want to fight for your freedom and they don't give you a gun, but forgive me, a spear, which is what John Brown would have given them, you would have had second thoughts. There was 400 African Americans in the 8 months after the raid who escaped, according to nothing less than the U.S. Census slave schedules. And there was 10 suspicious fires in the simple month from the raid to the trial. And yes, no, from the trial to the hangings, John Brown's hanging. And I think it was local African Americans, because the place was so tightly guarded by troops that they even detained the governor of Virginia. So I think it was a local, they did it. The war begins. Lincoln may have never been president had not John Brown caused divisions in opinion in the South, and it led to having 4 candidates for president. The Southern vote was split between Breckinridge and I guess Douglas, that's the Northern, electing Lincoln thereby. And I think what John Brown showed everybody is that the division between North and South emotionally was so much deeper than they ever dreamed. The Southern power elite, and it was a cabal of about 100 men that caused the Civil War to start, started to secede because they saw that for the first time they were not going to have the ball anymore. It's as simple as that. They didn't want to be in a country where they didn't control the ball. Jefferson County had one of the most poignant and complicated situations. We did not want to secede. We sent 2 delegates who were sworn against secession by a large margin. And anybody should read the entire transcript, which is at the Virginia State Library website. It is heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking. And the West Virginia delegates literally had to get out of town or be lynched. That's how bad it was at the end. The night before the vote, there was a meeting in a hotel with Governor Wise and General Imboden and a few others, Turner Ashby, and they planned to march on the Gosport Naval Yard and Harper's Ferry Armory before the vote. And that's called a coup. It was when Ashby was marching on the armory that night in Halltown in Jefferson County. The Union commander, Lieutenant Jones, got wind of it, and he blew it up just as they were within marching distance of the armory. But it was, and so the war was on. Even though there was supposed to be a referendum on May 23rd to formally, peacefully vote, it was moot now. Of course, we know that West Virginia began becoming a state very bravely. Jefferson County was so caught in the middle, it must be said that we sent a delegate named Kuntz, Mr. Kuntz, from George Kuntz, who came from Ohio. He came because he was a childhood friend of Edwin Stanton in Ohio, the head of the B&O. But he was the vote from Jefferson County in favor of secession for West Virginia. Therefore, we can simply say that Jefferson County became West Virginia, and Berkeley did, because they had to strategically. Lincoln had to have them in West Virginia to control the railroad. Jefferson County saw 1,300 days of strife. You had many divided families with one son fighting for the North and one from the South. Very often the younger men who favored the North saw it better just to leave, while their parents stayed behind. About 800 men, I think, enlisted in the Civil War in this county. But I think the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, Shepherdstown saw 5,000 wounded fill even its corn cribs, and it was young ladies learning how to feed a man who had a bullet go through his mouth at Snively House, Nettie Lee. And the battle was so horrendous that it was loud here. It was loud here 2 miles away. So that was the one of the most exceptional experiences in Jefferson County. The Maryland campaign The war continued back and forth, as you well know. After about May of 1863, in May of 63, Lincoln there was an order issued that for the enlistment of African American soldiers, which is the same month, interestingly, where Henrietta Lee in this county wrote that all of my laborers or slaves and servants are gone. Everyone did leave the first chance they could get. So the war proceeded. We had Mosby's raids. We had all kinds of low-intensity warfare. We had 3 homes burned to the ground, which is tragic. And, you know, wars get nasty. Partway through, wars always get nasty. And General Sheridan, who led a Sheridan's ride right through our valley in 1864, destroying a couple of thousand barns, he once told an overly polite, precious group of friends at a dinner in England, he said, after they were pattering along about war, he said, "In war you must go through and leave them only with their eyes to weep." And so war becomes as savage as it has to be to end. After the war, Jefferson County was at such a peculiar moment because it didn't feel like it was in West Virginia, but it was in West Virginia. It wanted to go back to Virginia, but it couldn't. It tried legally to, but failed. Even the Supreme Court finally rejected it. And so it lingered in this, those who were white lingered in this dream state for generations, looking back on this idyllic time which may have never existed. You know, if only we had won the war kind of fantasy. On the other hand, if you're African American, this is what happened. You got little villages. It took about 20 years for everybody to revive from the war. So around 1880 and 90, you see little villages. All over our county was Hartstown and companion towns to Carneysville. There was Hartstown, it was a black community. Shepherdstown had Philadelphia and Angel Hill. Charlestown had 2 very charmingly named names called Tater Hill and Dogtown, and Skeetersville. They had these wonderful names. But the point is, unlike the Deep South, there's a reason there's so many good leaders from the African American community from the Upper South. Henry Louis Gates is from Piedmont, West Virginia. Sullivan, or the Sullivan Principles for Apartheid, is from Charleston. Booker T. Washington was born in Malden, West Virginia. Douglas and Harriet Tubman were from Maryland. They're all, and Martin Delaney from Charleston, they're all from the Upper South. There's something interesting about that. And I think one of the reasons is this. They were community building after the war, and you have to have 3 things for a community to succeed: a church, a school, and owning your own land. And unlike the Deep South and South Carolina, we still had those things. So you would find along railroad sidings and this and that, you would see a Baptist church, an AME church, a little school, and people with their own land. So our communities stayed strong. Always very paradoxical. Here's a county that had slavery. Guess what? It had a man named James Roper who was free black farmer, who had 3 farms that each was over 100 acres, maybe 200. 3 of them, when the war broke out, and in 1868 when he died, he still had them. So there's, as James Taylor told me, an African-American, very respected man here, he told me the experience of an African-American in Jefferson County was such that if you took all the experiences and cut them in the cross-section and looked in, that's what Jefferson County was. But here's John Brown striking a blow for freedom in 1859, and it causes 700,000 deaths. But I like to say that the chronic tragedy of enslavement was only removed by the acute tragedy of a war that left infections. And so what I'm getting at is, almost poetically, Brown demonstrated that it took blood to be shed. Remember his prophecy? To get rid of slavery. Isn't it fascinating that in 1906, here comes the Second Niagara Movement. W.B. Du Bois gives a speech. It is the first time on American soil that the principles of the National Association of Colored People have been stated in this country. And it was asserting the same rights, but peaceably. And so you have like an echo of John Brown coming back to the sacred land of Harper's Ferry. And what they're saying this time is, we're going to smote you with nonviolence. And, you know, it all grew into the 60s. And what I love is that you had this thought about, you have Henry David Thoreau writing on civil disobedience, and that somehow gets into the hands of Gandhi, who's influenced by it. And oh no, Tolstoy reads it, and then he writes The Kingdom is Within, and then Gandhi reads The Kingdom Within. Each one passes along the power of nonviolent civil disobedience. So the point is, that mustard seed got planted in American soil in 1906 in Jefferson County and Harper's Ferry in deference to John Brown. And the peaceful resolve to eradicate injustice was established and ultimately succeeded.